TIFU by trying to impress my girlfriend with a fancy dinner and accidentally setting the kitchen on fire. It was supposed to be the perfect night. I had been dating Sarah for a few months now, and I wanted to do something special for her. She had always mentioned how much she loved Italian food, and I thought it would be a great idea to cook her a homemade dinner. Not just any dinner, though. I wanted to really impress her. I was thinking a full multi-course meal with a nice bottle of wine, candles, the whole romantic package. Now, I'm not a terrible cook, but I wouldn't exactly call myself a chef either. I can make a decent spaghetti or throw together a stir-fry, but I've never really gone all out. But I figured, how hard could it be to make a classic Italian dinner? I did some research and watched a few YouTube videos. I was feeling confident. I decided on a 3-course meal, a starter of bruschetta, a main course of homemade fettuccine alfredo, and a decadent chocolate lava cake for dessert. I spent the entire afternoon shopping for the ingredients. I scoured the aisles of the grocery store, picking out fresh tomatoes, basil, garlic, heavy cream, fettuccine, and all the other things I needed. I even splurged a little on a nice bottle of Chianti. Sarah was at work, and I had the house to myself. It was the perfect setup. Once I got home, I started prepping everything. I minced the garlic, chopped the tomatoes, and set up the pasta dough for the fettuccine. Everything was going smoothly, and I was feeling like a pro. I even set the dining table with candles, romantic music playing softly in the background, and the bottle of wine chilling. Then it was time to get cooking. I started with the bruschetta. How hard could it be? Toast some bread, mix the tomatoes and basil, and drizzle a little olive oil. Simple. I tossed the bread into the oven to toast, then I turned my attention to the fettuccine. I had made fresh pasta dough, and I was excited to roll it out and cut the fettuccine by hand. I got it all done and started boiling water for the pasta. That's when things started to go wrong. I had read online that you should always have a pot of water ready for your pasta, but for some reason, I didn't think it was important to wait until the water was boiling before I dropped the noodles in. I put them in too soon, and of course, they just stuck together in a giant, soggy mess. So, I had to drain them and start over. Not a big deal, just a minor setback. While I was waiting for the water to heat up, I decided to start making the Alfredo sauce. This should have been straightforward, just butter, cream, and Parmesan, but of course, I messed that up too. I didn't realize that the butter should be melted over low heat, and I threw it on high, which caused it to burn almost immediately. The sauce turned into a curdled mess, and I had to toss it out and start again. By this point, I was starting to feel the pressure. The clock was ticking. I could hear Sarah's car pulling into the driveway. She'd be home any minute, and I wasn't even close to being done. I still had the dessert to make, and I didn't even know if the pasta would turn out right now. I decided to take a deep breath, stay calm, and just get through it. That's when I heard a faint sizzling noise coming from the kitchen. I turned around, and my stomach dropped. The bruschetta bread had started to catch fire in the oven. In my flurry of pasta disasters, I had completely forgotten about the bread toasting in the oven. The edges were blackened, and smoke was billowing out. I rushed to open the oven door, and a few flames leaped up. My heart was pounding. This was it. The whole romantic dinner was going up in flames, literally. I grabbed the oven mitts, yanked the tray out, and set it on the counter. The fire quickly spread to the parchment paper and the plastic bag of breadcrumbs I had left too close to the oven. The whole kitchen was filled with smoke, and the fire alarm went off, screeching in my ears. I panicked. I didn't know what to do first. The smoke was thick, and I had no idea if the flames were under control. In a moment of sheer panic, I grabbed a nearby kitchen towel, dunked it under the sink, and tried to smother the fire. I might have seen this technique in some cooking show or another. It was a terrible idea. The towel just caught fire too, and now I was holding a flaming towel in one hand while frantically trying to put out the flames. I rushed to the sink, and in my haste, I knocked over the wine bottle. It shattered on the floor. At this point, Sarah walked in. She was absolutely horrified. There I was, standing in the middle of a disaster zone, smoke filling the air, burnt bread on the counter, broken glass everywhere, and me holding a flaming towel while I scrambled to put out the fire. "Oh my God, what happened?" she asked, her eyes wide with shock. I tried to make dinner for you," I stammered, feeling like the biggest idiot on the planet. She started laughing. Not in a mean way, but in the way someone does when they can't believe what they're seeing. I was on the verge of tears, and she was laughing. I'm sure she was relieved it wasn't anything worse, but still. I wanted to crawl under a rock and hide. After the fire was finally under control, we both opened the windows to clear the smoke out, and I started cleaning up the mess. Sarah grabbed the fire extinguisher for the towel fire and helped me wipe down the counter. In the end, there was no dinner, no romantic evening. The only thing we had was the faint smell of burnt toast and panic. We ended up ordering pizza and watching a movie. As disappointing as the whole situation was, Sarah took it like a champ. She said it was the thought that counted, and honestly, it was kind of hilarious looking back at how badly I had screwed it up. We spent the rest of the night laughing, but I promised her no more fancy cooking experiments. The next time we planned a nice dinner, I just let her cook. Lesson learned: if you're trying to impress someone with a meal, maybe just stick with a simple takeout order. That, or a fire extinguisher within arm's reach. Moral of the story? Don't try to be Gordon Ramsay on a random Tuesday when you're already a little out of your depth. Stick with what you know. And always remember to check the oven. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It helps the content grow and motivates me to create even more great videos. Turn on notifications so you don't miss any new uploads. By the way, I'm curious, when do you usually watch my videos? While working, studying, or just relaxing at home? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thank you for your support. I've always considered myself a pretty intelligent person. I'm not claiming to be some genius, but I've always prided myself on common sense and thinking through situations. Unfortunately, sometimes even the most well-thought-out plans can go completely sideways, and that's exactly what happened to me last weekend. It all started when I decided to be a good Samaritan. My neighbor, an older woman named Mrs. Jenkins, had asked me a few days prior to help her set up her new computer. She'd recently retired, and her kids had gifted her this fancy laptop for her birthday. It was one of those high-end models, the kind that makes you feel bad about owning your mid-range budget laptop. I've always been the tech person in the building, so whenever anyone needed help, they came to me. Now, Mrs. Jenkins was lovely, always offering cookies or asking if I needed anything from the store, but she was not the most tech-savvy person. She still used a flip phone and considered email to be a mystery. But she was determined to learn how to use this new computer, and I was happy to help. I figured I'd show her the basics, how to check email, browse the internet, and maybe introduce her to Facebook so she could connect with her kids. What could go wrong, right? I arrived at her apartment on Saturday morning, laptop in hand, and she welcomed me in with a big smile and a plate of oatmeal cookies. I sat down at the small dining table, ready to begin. Mrs. Jenkins told me she didn't need much, just wanted to know how to set up her email and maybe Skype her daughter. I assured her that I'd have it all done in no time. The first thing I noticed was that the laptop was still in its box, untouched, sitting in the corner of her living room like a new car that hadn't even been driven. It was clear she'd never even taken it out to try and set it up herself, so I went to work. I connected the laptop to her Wi-Fi, walked her through creating a new user account, and set up her email in a couple of minutes. All easy stuff. But then I got to Skype. Now, Skype is a pretty straightforward program, and I've used it countless times. But I guess I underestimated how unfamiliar Mrs. Jenkins would be with the whole concept. I explained what it was, how you could video call people, and that her daughter was probably using it on her end. Mrs. Jenkins seemed eager to give it a try, so I went ahead and downloaded it for her. As I clicked through the installation prompts, I saw her fidgeting with her hands nervously. "I don't know about this, dear," she said, her voice wavering. "What's the matter, Mrs. Jenkins?" I asked, glancing up at her. "Well, I just don't understand why anyone would want to video chat," she said, wrinkling her nose. "When I want to talk to someone, I just pick up the phone." I laughed, not realizing what was about to happen. "Believe me, it's a game changer," I said, a little too enthusiastically. "You'll be able to see your daughter, and it's super easy. You'll love it." I assured her everything would be fine and clicked the final install button for Skype. The program launched without a hitch, and she seemed slightly more at ease, though still not entirely sold on the whole thing. I told her to type in her daughter's name and give her a call. She did, but nothing happened. I asked if she'd entered the name correctly, and she said yes. I suggested maybe her daughter was offline. After a few minutes of checking settings and trying to make sense of the issue, I asked Mrs. Jenkins if she knew her daughter's Skype username. She looked at me with confusion. "Doesn't it just connect when you call someone?" she asked. "I mean, not always," I replied. "They need to be online and accept the call." She stared at me like I had just told her that I could teleport. That's when I made a critical error. Instead of suggesting she give her daughter a quick call to ask for her username, I thought it would be easier to just call someone else to test the system. And, being a responsible tech helper, I figured it would be totally fine to use my own Skype to show her how it worked. Big mistake. I didn't stop to think that Mrs. Jenkins would be watching me closely, and before I knew it, I had dialed myself. I assumed the call wouldn't go through because my Skype account was already logged in on my phone, but no, Skype rang through on her laptop. And in that moment, panic set in. Mrs. Jenkins was watching the screen intently as the call connected. The sound of my own voice echoed through the room, and I froze. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I couldn't hang up without her noticing. She was going to think I was some kind of wizard who could make video calls from thin air. I panicked, hit the volume button on the laptop to mute it, and desperately tried to think of a way to end the call without looking like an idiot. But it didn't end there. To my horror, Mrs. Jenkins started getting more excited. She pointed at the screen and said, "Oh, it's working. It's working. I see you." I had no choice but to play along, trying my best to act casual. "Yep, it's working," I said through gritted teeth. "I'm just showing you how the call works." But she wasn't listening. She kept waving at the screen, smiling, and saying, "Hello, dear. Oh, you look so handsome today." At this point, I was absolutely mortified. There was no escaping the situation, and all I could do was hope the call would end soon. But of course, it didn't. Mrs. Jenkins got even more enthusiastic. "Do you see me? Do you see me waving? Oh, I see you. You look so good, dear. It's so nice to see you." I had no idea what to do. I was caught in an endless loop of this accidental video call with my own face staring back at me, trying to act like I wasn't slowly dying inside. I kept muting the laptop, unmuting it, clicking around in a desperate attempt to figure out how to end this nightmare. But Mrs. Jenkins was so caught up in the excitement that she didn't notice the confusion on my face. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I managed to end the call and clear the screen. Mrs. Jenkins sat back, satisfied, and said, "Well, that was fun. I can't wait to try this with my daughter." I was so relieved, I almost fell off the chair. But I learned a valuable lesson that day: never, under any circumstances, try to demonstrate a tech feature when you're too panicked to remember basic functions. I'm still recovering from the awkwardness, and Mrs. Jenkins probably thinks I'm some kind of wizard now. TLDR, helped my neighbor set up her laptop, accidentally called myself on Skype, and got trapped in an awkward video call with my own reflection while trying to demonstrate the feature. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys a good routine. I like knowing what to expect, and I have a set pattern to my daily life that keeps me calm. But, apparently, this sense of control is something that can be shattered in an instant, as I learned the hard way this past weekend. It all started on a Saturday afternoon, when I was hanging out with a friend I hadn't seen in a while. Let's call him Steve. Steve and I were close back in college, but after graduation, we both got busy with our respective lives. He moved to another city, and we lost touch a little bit. Recently, though, he reached out to me and suggested we hang out. I thought it'd be nice to reconnect, so I agreed. Steve suggested we go to a barbecue at his cousin's house. I was hesitant at first because I'm not a huge fan of big parties. I've always been the type to shy away from crowds, but Steve insisted that it would be a low-key gathering, just a few friends and family members. I figured, why not? A couple of beers, some burgers, good company. It'll be fine. I told him I'd meet him there. Now, I should mention that I'm not exactly what you'd call a social butterfly. I tend to keep to myself, and socializing with people I don't know that well can make me anxious. But I figured I could get through it for the sake of catching up with Steve. I was wrong. The moment I arrived at his cousin's house, I was greeted by the sight of a massive crowd in the backyard. People were laughing, shouting, and enjoying themselves. There were kids running around, music blaring from speakers, and everyone seemed to know each other. I immediately felt out of place. Steve had warned me that the gathering was casual, but this was more than I bargained for. I wandered around a bit, trying to find Steve. After a couple of minutes, I spotted him near the grill, chatting with some other guys. He waved me over, and I felt a small sense of relief. At least I knew one person in this sea of strangers. Hey man. Glad you could make it. Steve greeted me enthusiastically as I approached. Yeah, no problem. It's good to see you, I replied, trying to mask my nervousness with a weak smile. We talked for a few minutes about how things had been going over the past few months. I'm not sure if Steve noticed how uncomfortable I was, but I felt like everyone around me was speaking in some kind of secret code I wasn't privy to. Inside jokes were flying, people were laughing hysterically at things I didn't understand, and I just wanted to shrink into the background. Eventually, Steve nudged me toward a group of his friends who were playing cornhole in the backyard. Come on, you gotta play. It's just for fun, he said, handing me a bag filled with beans. I hesitated. I've never been good at cornhole. Actually, I've never been good at any game that requires a certain level of hand-eye coordination. But Steve seemed excited, so I didn't want to back out. I joined the group, trying my best to look like I knew what I was doing. Now, here's where things went south. The game was supposed to be a relaxed activity, but as soon as I tossed my first bag, it went completely off course and landed in someone's drink. That person, let's call him Mike, wasn't too thrilled about that. He didn't say anything at first, but I could tell by the way his face turned red that he wasn't pleased. I apologized immediately. Sorry, man. Didn't mean to do that, I said, trying to laugh it off. Mike just muttered something under his breath and grabbed a new drink, but I could feel the tension. The rest of the group went quiet for a second, and I could tell I was the subject of their attention. I tried to act like it didn't bother me, but my palms started sweating. As the game continued, my anxiety grew. I was terrible at the game, and I kept throwing the bags off target. Every time I missed, I felt the eyes of the group on me, and it was becoming more and more unbearable. To make matters worse, Mike started making sarcastic remarks under his breath every time I failed, clearly mocking me. It felt like everyone was in on a joke that I wasn't a part of, and I just wanted to leave. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to excuse myself and go grab a drink from the cooler. I figured that a break from the game might calm my nerves. But as I turned around to walk toward the cooler, I accidentally bumped into a woman holding a plate full of food. She spilled her entire plate of grilled chicken, coleslaw, and potato salad all over the ground. It was like time slowed down in that moment. I froze, my face turning bright red. I muttered an apology and started to help her clean it up, but she wasn't having it. She gave me a glare that could have burned a hole in my soul. "You've gotta be kidding me," she said, rolling her eyes. Now, I was mortified. I could feel all eyes on me again. It was like I was the punchline to a joke I didn't understand. Steve tried to step in and make light of the situation, but it was clear that the damage had been done. I could hear some of the people snickering in the background. At that point, I just wanted to get out of there. I told Steve I needed to head home, and he looked at me with a mix of confusion and concern. I quickly excused myself, grabbed my keys, and left without looking back. As I drove home, I replayed the events over and over in my head. I felt like a complete failure. It was just supposed to be a simple hangout, but somehow, I had managed to embarrass myself in front of a bunch of strangers. I couldn't stop thinking about how awkward I had been and how out of place I felt the entire time. When I got home, I tried to shake off the embarrassment. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down to relax. But no matter what I did, I couldn't get rid of the feeling that I had somehow ruined the day. I wanted to reach out to Steve and apologize for being such a mess, but I wasn't sure if he even noticed how uncomfortable I was. A few days later, I got a text from Steve. It was a simple message: "Hey man, you good? Hope you didn't feel too weird at the barbecue. We'll hang out soon, yeah?" I sat there for a moment, staring at the message. It seemed like he genuinely cared, but I couldn't bring myself to reply right away. I didn't want to admit that I had basically had a social meltdown. I didn't want to come off as a weirdo or someone who couldn't handle a simple gathering. So, I texted back with a smiley face and a "Yeah, I'm fine, just been busy. Thanks for inviting me though." I'm not sure if that was the right thing to do. Part of me wanted to explain how awkward I felt, how I could barely talk to anyone without feeling like I was being judged. But I didn't. I guess I was just afraid that admitting the truth would make everything even more uncomfortable. In the end, I learned a valuable lesson. Sometimes it's okay to say no to social gatherings if you're not ready for them. You don't have to force yourself to fit into situations where you feel out of place. And most importantly, it's okay to be honest about your feelings without worrying about how people might judge you. I'm still working on that part, but I'm getting better. Anyway, that was my epic fail of a day. I still cringe every time I think about it, but at least I can laugh now, sort of. TIFU by accidentally causing a citywide traffic jam because I forgot how to drive. So, this happened just last week and it has officially ruined my life, well, at least for the next little while. I'm not exaggerating when I say this turned into a complete disaster. The kind of thing that makes you want to crawl into a hole and never come out. Let me start by saying, I'm not a terrible driver. I've been driving for years. I have a clean record, no accidents, and I've passed all my driving tests with flying colors. In fact, I'd say I'm a pretty confident driver. But last week? I learned the hard way that confidence alone doesn't always cut it. It all started because I had to drive to a job interview in another part of the city. I had been living in the same neighborhood for a while, and I wasn't unfamiliar with the route. It's about a 20-minute drive if the traffic isn't bad. So, when I got up that morning, I was feeling good. I had my suit on, a coffee in hand, and my playlist ready to go. The first sign that things were going to go wrong was when I sat in my car and realized that I hadn't driven in about 2 weeks. And when I say driven, I mean I hadn't actually been behind the wheel of a car since my last trip to the grocery store. Why? Because I had been working from home and relying on public transportation or my bike for a while. So, this would be my first time behind the wheel in a while, but I figured it would be fine. What could go wrong? I backed out of my parking space, turned onto the street, and immediately realized that I was a little rusty. The car felt bigger than I remembered. I couldn't seem to get the steering wheel right, and my foot was a little heavier than I thought it would be on the gas pedal. But I pushed through it. It's just like riding a bike, I told myself. But then came the first major mistake. As I approached a roundabout, I was momentarily confused. I have no idea why, but the idea of turning left, right, or staying in the lane totally threw me off. I panicked for a second and almost drove straight into a bike lane. I managed to correct myself at the last second, but by the time I was out of the roundabout, I felt that familiar unease creeping up my spine. I was definitely out of practice. I tried to shake it off. Just focus, I told myself. You know how to drive. You've done this a million times. But my troubles really started when I hit the highway. It wasn't rush hour, but traffic was heavier than usual. I merged onto the main road and immediately felt that weird, unfamiliar feeling again. The lanes felt narrower. The speed of the cars around me seemed to make the road appear smaller. I was starting to sweat. I tried to push it down, but I couldn't. My hands were gripping the wheel too tightly, my knuckles white. I could feel my chest tightening, and I was becoming hyper-aware of every little thing, the way the tires hummed against the asphalt, the slight click of the turn signal, the way the car behind me seemed to be getting uncomfortably close. That's when I made my second huge mistake. I overcorrected. I wasn't paying attention and accidentally swerved a little too much to the right. I went over the rumble strip, causing a loud bzzzzz noise. That was it, I panicked. I slammed on the brakes, which is obviously not what you should do in that situation. Of course, the car behind me didn't have time to react. It honked loudly, which only made me more anxious. In my attempt to regain control, I jerked the wheel, which caused the car to fishtail. Thankfully, I didn't spin out, but the car veered dangerously close to the guardrail. Now, I was in full-blown panic mode. The only thing I could think of was getting off the highway. I took the next exit, and by some miracle, I managed to safely get off the main road. But I wasn't in a much better place. Now I was just driving on surface streets that were unfamiliar. Here's where things went from bad to worse. I got completely lost. I had no idea where I was. At all. I mean, I had a general idea of where I was in the city, but I hadn't realized how many winding side streets and confusing intersections there were in this part of town. I tried pulling up my GPS, but I was so flustered I couldn't even get the map to load properly. I was driving in circles. Every time I thought I was on the right street, it would turn into another street, or the name would change. I was losing precious time, and with each passing minute, my anxiety grew. The clock on the dashboard felt like it was mocking me as the minutes ticked away. I finally decided to pull over to the side of the road and figure things out. And that's when I noticed something that completely threw me off. I had somehow ended up on a major road going the wrong way. There were cars honking and swerving to avoid me. My heart nearly stopped. The last thing I wanted was to be the person who caused an accident, so I immediately pulled over to the curb. But this wasn't just a small mistake. The way I had positioned my car in the street had blocked off not one, but 2 lanes of traffic. And it was a busy time of day. Cars were piling up behind me, honking their horns. I could see the frustration in their eyes as they tried to figure out how to get around me. I wasn't even sure how to fix the situation. I was frozen with panic. I was too afraid to move my car, and the traffic started to build. Eventually, someone in the car behind me got out, came up to my window, and asked if I needed help. I wish I could tell you I handled it with grace, but instead, I just burst into tears. I couldn't stop myself. The guy who came to help turned out to be a saint. He calmly told me to stay in my car, took the keys, and moved the car to a safe spot while directing the traffic around. He called the authorities to make sure everything was cleared up. By the time I managed to calm down enough to get out of the car, there was a full-on traffic jam. What started as my simple mistake had escalated into a complete mess. There were police officers, tow trucks, and more honking cars than I ever thought possible. I felt like the whole city was against me. I never did make it to the interview. To make matters worse, I had to spend the next few hours answering questions from the police about what happened. They were actually really nice about it, but the whole thing was just so embarrassing. Moral of the story, I learned that sometimes, you can forget how to do something you thought was second nature, and it can cause way more trouble than you ever expected. I'm never underestimating the power of driving again. And, just to add insult to injury, I ended up rescheduling the interview for the following week, only to get an email a few days later saying they had already filled the position. So yeah, lesson learned. I'm sticking to public transportation for a while. Hopefully, no one remembers my face. End of the line for me. TIFU by accidentally starting a fire in my neighbor's house and almost burning down the whole block. Let me set the stage. I'm a 28-year-old guy, and I live in a pretty quiet suburban neighborhood. It's the kind of place where everyone knows each other by name, and you can count on your neighbors for favors, like borrowing sugar or watching your dog for a few hours. Now, this was a Saturday afternoon, and I had just moved in about 6 months ago. I still wasn't super close with my neighbors, but we'd exchanged pleasantries and waved at each other when we passed. My neighbor, Mr. Williams, an elderly man in his 70s, was a bit of a recluse. He kept to himself most of the time. You'd rarely see him outside, except for when he was tending to his garden, which he'd obsessively maintain. It was his pride and joy. Every time I saw him, he was either watering plants or muttering to them like they were his best friends. I didn't think much of it, he was an old guy with his quirks. But he always seemed nice enough. On this particular Saturday, I was out doing some yard work, raking leaves, trimming hedges, just the usual stuff. It wasn't the most exciting way to spend a weekend, but I didn't mind it. As I was finishing up, I noticed Mr. Williams had his garage door open. I saw him struggling with something in there, and being the good neighbor I thought I was, I decided to check on him and see if he needed help. I walked over, knocked on the door frame, and he turned around, startled. He was holding a canister of gasoline. "Hey there, young man," Mr. Williams said with a smile that immediately made me feel bad for interrupting him. "Can I help you with something?" "Hey, Mr. Williams. I saw you in the garage, and I was wondering if you needed a hand with anything," I said, trying to be helpful. He looked at the canister in his hand and then at me. "Oh, I'm just doing some work on my lawnmower. It's been acting up, and I figured I'd give it a little maintenance. Do you know anything about small engines?" "Now, I don't know anything about engines. Seriously, nothing. I'm the kind of guy who looks at a car engine like it's some sort of alien technology." So I just smiled awkwardly and said, "Not really, but if you need a hand with anything else, just let me know." "Actually," he said, "you might be able to help. You see, I was going to drain some old gasoline out of the mower, but I'm not quite sure how to dispose of it. I can't just pour it down the drain, right?" I had no idea, but I assumed there was some kind of protocol for that sort of thing. "I think you're supposed to take it to a special recycling center or something," I said, trying to sound like I knew what I was talking about. Mr. Williams scratched his head. "Well, that sounds right, but I've got this old barbecue grill I'm planning to get rid of, and it's just sitting here in the garage. I was thinking maybe I could pour the old gas in the grill, light it up, and let it burn out. You know, safely." He looked at me for approval, clearly wanting a second opinion. I wasn't sure if that was a good idea, but I wasn't about to say no. I mean, I didn't want to seem like an idiot, so I just nodded and said, "Yeah, sounds good to me. Just be careful with the fire." He smiled and patted me on the back. "Good man. I'll get this sorted in no time. Thanks for the help, son." I wasn't really much help, but I was glad to have avoided having to deal with the gasoline situation myself. So I went back to my yard work, and everything seemed fine. Now, here's where I screwed up. I didn't think to mention that Mr. Williams probably shouldn't light gasoline in a grill, especially if there was still some leftover fuel in there. I figured he knew what he was doing, and besides, he was the one with the decades of life experience. What did I know? A few minutes later, I heard the unmistakable sound of fire crackling. Then, I heard what sounded like a small explosion. I turned around to see a massive cloud of smoke billowing out of Mr. Williams' garage. My stomach dropped. I ran over to his house, heart pounding in my chest. As I got closer, I saw him standing outside, looking at the garage in shock. There was a fire in the grill, and it was quickly spreading to the garage. Flames were licking at the edges of the door, and I could hear the crackling of burning wood and plastic. I screamed at Mr. Williams, "Get back, get back. It's spreading." He just stood there, frozen in shock. I pulled him away from the flames, and we ran across the street to a neighbor's house. I didn't even stop to think about how bad it could get. It was a neighbor's house, it was a fire, and my brain just couldn't keep up with the urgency of the situation. I grabbed my phone and called 911, my hands shaking. I explained what had happened and told them there was a fire at Mr. Williams' house. They said they'd send a crew over immediately. I stood there, staring at the flames, feeling like the world was crumbling around me. This was all my fault. I had encouraged the guy to set fire to the gas in the grill. What had I been thinking? Now the entire block was at risk. Thankfully, the fire department arrived in what felt like no time at all. They managed to put out the fire before it spread too far, but not before it did some significant damage to Mr. Williams' garage and part of his house. I could barely bring myself to look at the charred mess in his driveway. The firemen looked at the two of us and then at the grill. "Who started this?" one of them asked. Mr. Williams pointed a shaky finger at me. He was just trying to help. The firefighter looked at me and sighed. "Next time, call the pros before lighting gasoline on fire in a grill. That's not how any of this works." I felt like the world's biggest idiot. After the fire was put out, Mr. Williams and I had to go through insurance and repair talks. It was a mess. I tried to help him with whatever I could, but honestly, I still don't know how I let this happen. The worst part was that, even though Mr. Williams wasn't mad at me, I couldn't shake the guilt. I had nearly burned down the whole block because I didn't speak up and stop the crazy idea of lighting gasoline in a grill. A few weeks later, Mr. Williams and I had a long talk over coffee. He reassured me that it wasn't the end of the world, that stuff happens, and that he still considered me a good neighbor. But every time I see him tending to his garden, I wonder if he's secretly plotting how to get revenge on the guy who almost set his house, and the entire neighborhood, on fire. Moral of the story: when someone asks for your advice on setting gasoline on fire, please say no. And if you're ever in doubt, just call a professional. Trust me, it's worth it. TIFU by accidentally getting myself banned from a job I've been working at for 3 years. So this story starts about 3 years ago. I, 25M, was fresh out of college and desperately looking for a job. I was living with my parents, working part-time at a local coffee shop just to make ends meet. My dream job was always in marketing, and after months of applying and interviewing, I finally landed an entry-level position at a mid-sized marketing agency. I couldn't believe it, this was my big break. The kind of job I had been waiting for. I started working at the agency and immediately fell in love with the place. The work was interesting, and the people were amazing. I had a small team, and we mostly worked on client accounts, coming up with social media strategies, ad campaigns, and content creation. At first, things were going great. I was learning a ton and making friends. I even got along with my manager, Tom, who was the head of our department. Tom was a great guy. He was funny, a little quirky, and very supportive. He helped me a lot in those first few months, and I found myself enjoying work more and more. But of course, like any new job, there were little bumps along the way. There were occasional misunderstandings, missed deadlines, and small mistakes that came with the territory of being new to the role. Then, about a year into my job, things took a turn. One of our biggest clients, an e-commerce company, asked for a major redesign of their website, and the deadline was fast approaching. This redesign was essential to them, and the pressure was on. Tom, who had been overseeing everything, was busy managing multiple projects and couldn't keep track of all the details. So, he decided to delegate some of the responsibility to me. He told me to work closely with the design team and help implement the changes based on the client's feedback. At this point, I felt confident in my abilities. I'd been there long enough to know how the agency worked, and I had a decent understanding of web design and UX/UI principles. I figured this was my chance to prove myself. That's when things went horribly wrong. I was working with the design team on some revisions, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. They gave me a list of changes the client wanted, and I was supposed to relay them to the web development team. There were lots of small details, like adjusting colors, repositioning text, and adding new images. At the same time, I was also trying to juggle my regular workload, so I was working long hours to stay on top of everything. Then, one afternoon, my manager, Tom, came over to my desk. He looked stressed, which wasn't uncommon given the pressure of the deadline. But what happened next still haunts me. "Hey, I need you to fix this issue right away," he said, showing me the list of changes from the client. He pointed to a particular change that had been listed twice. The client had asked for the same change in 2 different ways. It wasn't a huge issue, but it needed to be clarified. Tom's exact words were, "Just fix this quickly, and let's move on." Now, here's where I messed up. In my tired, overworked state, I misread his request. I thought he meant I should make a decision between the 2 conflicting instructions. So, I picked one version of the change, made it, and moved on to other tasks. I was under the impression that I had made the right call because Tom didn't seem to think it was a big deal. Later that day, Tom walked into the office with a look of horror on his face. "The client just called. They're furious," he said. "You picked the wrong version of the change. They hate it. They said it completely alters the vision they had for the site." My stomach dropped. I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I tried to explain my reasoning, but Tom wasn't having it. He was stressed, and I could see that he was really angry. He didn't yell at me, but the disappointment in his eyes was enough to make me feel like I'd ruined everything. The rest of the day was a blur. I spent hours fixing the mistake and trying to salvage what I could. But the damage was done. The next morning, I got an email from the client. It was a formal complaint, essentially saying that they were reconsidering their relationship with the agency. They mentioned the mistake and how it could affect the launch. Tom forwarded the email to me and added a note, "We need to talk about this." We sat down in his office, and Tom was visibly upset. He explained that the mistake was huge, and it could cost the agency the account. I felt awful. I tried to apologize, but he just shook his head. "I don't know what happened," he said. "This is bad. We might not be able to recover from this." I was devastated. I had worked so hard, and now it seemed like everything was falling apart because of one mistake. I stayed late for the next few days, trying to help fix things, but it wasn't enough. The client decided to pull out, and it ended up being a massive blow to the agency. Then came the worst part. I showed up to work one morning and was called into Tom's office. He looked up at me and said, "I'm sorry, but I have to let you go." My heart sank. Apparently, the agency had been under a lot of pressure to keep the client, and after my mistake, they felt they couldn't trust me to handle major accounts. The loss of the client was a huge hit, and I was the scapegoat. Tom said it wasn't entirely my fault, but it was clear that I was the one who had made the mistake, and the company couldn't afford to take any more chances. I was in shock. I tried to plead my case, explaining that I had been working long hours and had made the decision based on what I thought was best. But it didn't matter. I was escorted out of the building, and just like that, my dream job was over. That was 2 years ago. I've bounced back since then, finding another job at a different marketing firm. But what still kills me is that I lost my job over a simple mistake. I'll never forget how quickly everything fell apart. I guess I'll always wonder if things would have been different if I had just asked for clarification instead of making assumptions. So yeah, TIFU by accidentally getting myself banned from a job I'd been working at for 3 years. All it took was one mistake, one bad decision, and my entire career took a nosedive. Lesson learned: don't assume you understand what your boss wants, and always double-check before you make big decisions. So, this happened a few days ago, and I'm still not sure whether I should laugh or cry about it. It all started when my girlfriend and I decided to have a nice, relaxing weekend getaway. We had been talking about taking a trip for months, but with work, life, and everything else, we hadn't really gotten around to planning anything. But finally, we made it happen. We booked a cabin in the woods for the weekend, just the two of us, no distractions, just nature and some good old-fashioned peace and quiet. Now, let me give you a little context. My girlfriend, Lisa, is the planner of the two of us. She's the one who makes sure all the details are handled and everything runs smoothly. I, on the other hand, I'm a bit more laid back. Some might say I'm spontaneous, but I'm mostly just disorganized and tend to procrastinate. It's not that I don't care about things, I just have a tendency to be a little less focused on the small stuff. That's how I ended up getting into this mess. We were all packed and ready to go, and everything seemed perfect. The drive to the cabin was beautiful, the weather was great, and we were both in high spirits. We arrived, got settled in, and started to unwind. It was a peaceful, idyllic setting, just what we needed to recharge. The first evening went perfectly. We had dinner, watched a movie, and then went to bed early, both of us feeling pretty relaxed. We were excited about the next day's plans, hiking, exploring, and just enjoying each other's company in the middle of nowhere. The next morning, after a leisurely breakfast, we decided to head out for a hike. Lisa, being the prepared one, had packed a small backpack with water, snacks, and some first aid supplies, just in case. I, on the other hand, just threw on some sneakers, grabbed my phone, and was ready to go. It wasn't a long hike, just a couple of miles through the woods, but Lisa was still adamant that we bring a map. I thought it was a little overkill, but I didn't argue. We set out, and for the first few hours, everything went great. We were enjoying the fresh air, laughing, and just soaking in the beauty of the nature around us. That's when things started to take a turn. We took a wrong turn somewhere. Now, I'm not saying it was entirely my fault, but I did have the map, and I was the one who thought I knew the way. Lisa had been asking me if we should turn around and check the map, but I kept reassuring her that we were fine. I had been hiking in the area a couple of times before, so I figured I knew where we were going. Mistake number 1. Eventually, we realized that we were way off track. We had been hiking for hours, and the trail we were following wasn't matching up with the map anymore. We were in the middle of the woods, with no signs of civilization, and I started to panic a little. Lisa, on the other hand, kept her cool. She told me to stop being dramatic and that we'd figure it out. But the further we walked, the more disoriented we became. We came across a few more trails, none of which seemed familiar. Lisa tried to stay optimistic, but I could tell she was getting a little worried too. At this point, we had no choice but to retrace our steps. We started heading back in the direction we thought we'd come from, but it didn't take long to realize that we were lost. My phone, of course, had no signal. Lisa's phone had just enough battery to make one call, but we didn't have anyone to call. We didn't know where we were, and no one knew where we were supposed to be. It was just the two of us, lost in the woods, and neither of us had the skills to get out of it. After what felt like hours of walking in circles, I suggested we stop and rest. We were both exhausted, dehydrated, and starting to get a little cranky. We found a nice clearing and decided to sit down for a break. Lisa was looking through her backpack for the snacks, and I was staring at the map again, trying to make sense of where we had gone wrong. Then, in the midst of my frustration, I noticed something. The map I had been using was upside down. The whole time, I had been following the wrong path. I had been completely misreading the map. I had led us farther away from the cabin than we had already been, and it hit me like a ton of bricks. I turned to Lisa, who had been quietly sipping her water, and I sheepishly admitted what I'd done. She just stared at me for a second, trying to process what I was saying, and then she started laughing. I could see the frustration in her face, but she just started to laugh. "You're kidding, right?" she said. "We're lost because you didn't even know which way we were supposed to go?" I felt like an idiot. But at least she was laughing. That's when the full scope of how bad things had gotten really hit me. We were lost. I had no idea how to get us out of there. And I had somehow managed to turn what should have been a relaxing weekend getaway into a potential disaster. Eventually, Lisa managed to calm herself down and told me we needed to just keep walking. We had to find our way out of this mess. We couldn't just sit there and wait for someone to find us, we had to take action. After another couple of hours of walking and retracing our steps, thankfully, we weren't completely off track. We finally stumbled upon another group of hikers. They had a GPS device, and after asking for directions, they were able to guide us back to the trailhead. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was already getting dark. We were tired, hungry, and more than a little stressed out. The whole hike had taken way longer than expected, and it was clear that we were both mentally and physically drained. But Lisa, in her infinite patience, was just glad to be back. She wasn't mad, but I could tell she was pretty disappointed in how I handled everything. I knew I'd messed up, and it was obvious that she wasn't going to let me live it down anytime soon. We ended up spending the rest of the weekend in the cabin, a little shaken but still together. I did everything I could to make it up to her, cooked dinner, cleaned, and even made an effort to plan out our next day's activities, with her guidance, of course. But every now and then, she'd remind me of how I almost got us stranded in the woods. Every time she brought it up, I just had to laugh with her. After all, what else could I do? So yeah, TIFU by getting myself and my girlfriend lost in the woods because I was too proud to admit I didn't know where I was going and couldn't read a map correctly. Lesson learned, always let the planner handle the planning. I don't know what possessed me to think it was a good idea. Maybe it was the thrill of trying something new, maybe it was the fact that I was bored out of my mind on a random Tuesday afternoon, or maybe it was because I thought, hey, how bad could it be? Well, let me tell you, it was bad. Not just bad, but one of the worst decisions I've ever made in my life. I'm talking about the time I decided to use a stranger's bathroom. It all started when I was visiting a small town for a work conference. I'd never been there before, and I had some downtime between sessions. I wasn't exactly thrilled to be stuck in a hotel room for hours with nothing to do, so I went for a walk around the town to get some fresh air. It was quaint, picturesque even. There were little mom-and-pop shops, a bakery with the smell of freshly baked bread wafting out onto the street, and a small cafe that seemed to be the heart of the community. I had been walking for about an hour when I realized something crucial: I needed to use the bathroom. I looked around, but there were no public restrooms in sight. I wasn't about to walk all the way back to my hotel room just to use the bathroom, so I figured I'd pop into one of the cafes or shops and ask if I could use theirs. Simple enough, right? I mean, I wasn't going to ask to use the bathroom in the middle of a restaurant during peak hours, but surely a small local business wouldn't mind me using their facilities. I walked into the first cafe I came across. The place looked cozy enough, with mismatched tables and chairs and a few people scattered around, sipping on their lattes. The woman behind the counter looked up as I approached, and I gave her a polite smile. "Hi, I'm sorry to bother you, but could I use your restroom?" She gave me a once-over and then pointed to the back of the cafe. "It's down the hall," she said, not missing a beat. I thanked her and made my way toward the back. As I walked through the small hallway leading to the restroom, I noticed that the cafe was oddly quiet. There was no music playing, no background noise of chatter or the hum of espresso machines. It was like a weird, eerie silence had settled in. I shook it off as just the odd vibe of a small, quiet town cafe. I opened the door to the bathroom, and that's when everything went south. At first, I didn't notice anything too strange. The bathroom was clean, if a bit dated, with pale yellow tiles on the walls and a small sink in the corner. I stepped inside, locked the door behind me, and did my business. Then, as I was washing my hands, I noticed something odd in the mirror. There was a small, square window high up on the wall, just above the sink. It wasn't big enough to be a proper window to the outside. It looked more like a leftover feature from when the building had been an old house or something. It wasn't something I paid much attention to at first, but I couldn't help but glance up at it as I dried my hands. And that's when I saw it. A face. It was just a brief flash, a quick movement behind the window. At first, I thought I had imagined it. I wasn't sure if it was my reflection playing tricks on me or if there was actually someone on the other side of the window. My heart rate started to pick up, but I told myself I was being paranoid. After all, it was probably just a part of the old building I hadn't noticed before. Maybe it was just the angle of the light, or maybe it was a reflection of someone standing in the hallway outside. But then, I heard a soft knocking sound. Not from the door, but from the window. I froze. My first thought was, okay, maybe this is some sort of weird prank. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the bathroom for any signs of what was going on. There was no one else in the bathroom with me, but I could still hear the faint knocking. Knock, knock, knock. I walked closer to the window, and when I peered up at it, I saw something I will never forget. There was a handprint on the glass. A child's handprint. It was smudged, as if someone had pressed their hand against it and then dragged their fingers down, leaving a greasy, blurry streak. I couldn't see anyone standing behind the window, but there was clearly something strange going on. I don't know why, but I felt like I was being watched. My mind was racing. Was it some sort of hidden camera prank? Or was there something genuinely weird going on in this town? At this point, I was desperate to get out of the bathroom, but my curiosity, and, let's be honest, the sheer fear of the situation, kept me there for a moment longer. I stepped back, trying to get a better view of the window. I wanted to see if I could spot any clues that would explain what was happening. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. A dark, large shadow moved behind the window, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was like someone was walking around on the other side, slowly, deliberately. Without thinking, I yanked open the door and bolted out of the bathroom. My heart was racing, and my breath was coming in shallow gasps as I made my way back to the main part of the cafe. The woman behind the counter barely looked up as I rushed past her, muttering some half-baked excuse about needing to get back to my hotel. I didn't stop to explain. I didn't want to stick around long enough to make myself seem like a lunatic. I made it back to my hotel without incident, but the whole thing stuck with me. I kept imagining the handprint on the window, the sound of knocking, the strange shadow moving behind it. What was it? Was it just some weird coincidence, or was there something more sinister going on? I ended up leaving the town the next day, cutting my trip short. I never went back to that cafe, and to this day, I still have no idea what I saw. Maybe I was just tired, maybe I was just imagining things, but there's something about that experience that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. So yeah, TIFU by using a stranger's bathroom and possibly encountering something otherworldly. Hey, friends! If you enjoy this content, don't forget to like the video and share your thoughts in the comments. We really want to know what you like and what can be improved. What do you think of the video? Are there any topics you'd like to see in future videos? Your feedback really helps us get better. Thanks for being with us. So, here's the story. I still can't believe I'm typing this out, but here we are. A few weeks ago, I was at my best friend's wedding. I've known Jason since college, and we've been inseparable ever since. He met Sarah in grad school, and to be honest, I was pretty skeptical about her at first. I mean, we all have that one friend who gets into a relationship and suddenly forgets what having a social life is like. But over time, I saw they genuinely clicked, and they were good for each other. I got over my reservations. I was the best man at their wedding, and to say I was nervous would be an understatement. I had the speech prepared, the ring in hand, and had rehearsed everything down to the finest details. But let's just say, life had other plans. The ceremony itself went perfectly. Everything was as you'd imagine it, emotional, beautiful, and romantic. Jason and Sarah exchanged vows. I tried not to cry in front of everyone, and we all had an amazing time watching them start their new chapter together. Then came the reception, where I was responsible for the toast. Now, I've given plenty of speeches before, mostly at family gatherings and informal events, but this one? This one was different. I had to nail it. I went up to the podium with my drink in hand, cleared my throat, and started. I went on about how long I've known Jason, how much he's grown over the years, and how proud I was to be standing by his side on this special day. The crowd was eating it up. I even got a few laughs, which I felt pretty good about. But then, I did something that, in hindsight, was beyond stupid. I thought it would be a funny idea to tell a story about Jason and Sarah. Now, I had this one story in my back pocket that I thought would land well. It was a harmless, funny story about the first time Jason introduced Sarah to us as his girlfriend. It involved a hilarious misunderstanding where Jason, ever the nervous type, accidentally made Sarah think we were a cult. In my mind, it was a charming and hilarious anecdote, and I thought it'd lighten the mood. But here's where everything went horribly wrong. I started telling the story, and it was going smoothly at first. Everyone was laughing, Jason was chuckling, and Sarah was giving me a "you better not embarrass me" look. But the deeper I went into the story, the more I realized it wasn't landing quite the way I'd hoped. People were still laughing, sure, but the vibe in the room had changed. Jason looked uncomfortable. Sarah? Well, she was glaring at me now. I brushed it off and carried on, thinking maybe I was just overthinking it. I reached the part where I told everyone about the moment Jason accidentally said something that made Sarah think we were all a part of a secret, weirdly organized cult. Everyone laughed, but this time, Jason's face dropped, and his eyes widened like he was about to implode. Now, I should have known something was off. You know when someone's facial expression changes so drastically that it feels like you might have said something wrong? Yeah, that was happening. I finished the story, raised my glass for a toast, and asked everyone to join me in congratulating the newlyweds. But something was different. The tension in the air was palpable. I quickly exited the stage, trying to brush it off, but I could feel a knot forming in my stomach. What had I done? Later on, at the reception dinner, I started to notice a weird shift in the way people were interacting. I caught Jason whispering to a couple of his groomsmen, and Sarah was speaking in hushed tones with her bridesmaids. I decided to not make a big deal out of it. Maybe it was just wedding stress, right? But then came the bombshell. At the very end of the night, after all the food, drinks, and dancing had settled, Jason came up to me, looking utterly defeated. He told me we needed to talk. I agreed, thinking it was something about the wedding or the speech. Boy, was I wrong. Jason pulled me aside, and his face was full of frustration. Dude, I can't believe you told that story about Sarah, he said, almost whispering. I was taken aback. What do you mean? It was funny. Everyone laughed. Jason shook his head. It wasn't funny, man. It wasn't funny to Sarah. He paused, clearly struggling with his words. She thought you were making fun of her. That story is about something really personal to her. You made it sound like she's some idiot who didn't understand our group. It was embarrassing for her, and she didn't want to say anything in front of everyone, but it really upset her. I felt my stomach drop. Wait, what? But Jason, it was a harmless story. You guys laugh about it all the time. He sighed. I know I laugh about it. But she doesn't. That whole cult thing? It's something she's really insecure about. When we first started dating, she had a tough time fitting in with my friends, and that story reminded her of all those old feelings. It made her feel like we were making fun of her. I stood there, stunned. I hadn't thought about it from her perspective. I was just trying to tell a funny story that I thought would highlight how much Jason had grown and how we all got along. But instead, I had accidentally hit a nerve and made her feel isolated and mocked. I wanted to apologize right away, but I didn't know what to say. It was too late in the night, and I could see the disappointment in Jason's eyes. The next day, I sent Sarah a long message apologizing for what I'd done, trying to explain my intentions, but I'm not sure it helped. She replied saying she appreciated the apology but needed some space. I understood. Honestly, I deserved it. Jason and I haven't talked much about it since. The wedding went off without a hitch in the grand scheme of things, but I feel like I've permanently damaged my relationship with Sarah. It was an honest mistake, but it's something I should have been more aware of. If I could go back and change how I handled that speech, I absolutely would. But now, every time I see them together, I feel like there's an invisible barrier between us. So yeah, TIFU by trying to be funny and telling a story that ended up upsetting my best friend's wife on their wedding day. If you're ever in a similar situation, maybe think twice before digging into those old stories, especially if they involve misunderstandings that someone might not find as funny as you do. TIFU by accidentally starting a small fire in my apartment and almost burning down the entire building because I didn't know how to use a toaster. So, I'll start off by saying that I am an idiot. I'm in my mid-20s, living in a small apartment by myself. I work from home, which means I spend most of my days in the same spot, barely leaving the apartment. I don't really cook much. In fact, I barely cook at all. I live off takeout, frozen meals, and occasionally microwave food when I'm feeling especially adventurous. However, a few days ago, I decided that I wanted to do something different for breakfast. I thought I could finally use the toaster that had been sitting in my kitchen untouched for months. I had a couple of slices of bread, and the idea of toasted bread with some butter sounded amazing. Now, to be honest, I wasn't the best at cooking before moving to my apartment, but I figured using a toaster couldn't be that difficult. You just put the bread in, push the lever down, and wait for it to pop up, right? Simple enough. I've watched my parents do it countless times when I was younger, and I've seen it in movies, so I thought I had it all figured out. The first mistake I made was not realizing that there was a specific setting for how dark or light you wanted your toast. I didn't even know what the dial was for. I figured I would just leave it at the default setting, and that would be fine. I tossed the slices of bread in the toaster, pushed the lever down, and began to wait. I stood there, watching the bread slowly sink into the toaster and thinking, wow, I'm really cooking like an adult now. It felt like a small victory. I was ready to butter my toast and feel like I had my life together for once. After about 2 minutes, I heard a weird sizzling sound. It wasn't the pleasant crisping sound you hear when making toast. No, this was more of a crackling sound, something you might hear if you were cooking bacon on high heat in a poorly maintained pan. My heart sank. I quickly approached the toaster, and that's when I saw the first signs of something going wrong. The bread had caught on fire. I panicked. I mean, what do you do in that situation? Do you open the toaster and try to blow out the fire? I'd seen that in movies, but I knew that opening the toaster would probably make the flames worse. I grabbed the toaster, pulled it out from the counter, and tried to get the flaming bread out of there. I managed to yank it out of the toaster, but the fire didn't go out. It just spread. At this point, I realized that I had never been told how to safely handle a toaster fire. I'm sure there's probably a safety tip somewhere about how to handle electrical appliances when they catch fire, but I had never bothered to read anything about it. I started panicking harder, trying to smother the fire with a dish rag. But it was no use. The rag caught fire too. So now I had flaming bread and a burning dish rag in my hands, and my brain went completely haywire. I ran into the living room, dropping the flaming towel in a desperate attempt to get rid of it, but it only made the fire spread faster. I have a small studio apartment, so there's really nowhere to run. The flames were starting to spread to the counter, and I could feel the heat intensifying. I didn't know what to do, but at this point, I was definitely in over my head. I wasn't exactly sure if my apartment was going to burn down or if I was about to make things worse by trying to act like I had a clue. In a moment of sheer panic, I remembered the fire extinguisher I had bought a few months ago when I moved in. It had been sitting in the corner of the kitchen gathering dust, a silent reminder of how I'd convinced myself I was responsible. But, of course, I had never actually taken it out of the box. I ran over to the fire extinguisher and fumbled around trying to figure out how to open the damn thing. The instructions were tiny and unreadable, and I was so worked up at this point that I couldn't focus on anything. Eventually, I figured it out. But just as I did, I realized something. I hadn't even called 911 yet. I grabbed my phone and dialed emergency services while simultaneously pointing the fire extinguisher at the flames. I was holding it wrong at first, so it sprayed foam all over the kitchen. This only made the situation worse. Now I had a kitchen full of foam, charred bread, a dish rag on fire, and smoke billowing everywhere. The 911 dispatcher on the other end of the line was calm, which honestly just made me feel worse. She asked for my address, and I gave it to her in a rushed, panicked voice. She calmly instructed me to get out of the apartment. But I couldn't just leave, it was my stuff. And, more importantly, I had a dog. I rushed to the other room, grabbed my dog, who was terrified and barking, and ran outside. My mind was all over the place, and I could hear sirens in the distance. I stood in the hallway, holding my dog, trying to steady my breathing. When the fire department arrived, they rushed into the apartment and quickly put out the fire. They were really good about it, but they also made it clear that it could have been much worse if I had waited any longer to call them. They told me the fire hadn't spread beyond the kitchen, but it was still bad enough to make the place uninhabitable for a while. The fire damage was mainly contained to the kitchen, but the smoke had spread throughout the apartment. After the fire was out and the smoke cleared, the fire department told me that I had made several mistakes in handling the situation. First, they said I should have just left the toaster alone and let it burn out, not try to handle it myself. Second, they emphasized how important it was to call 911 immediately before trying to fight the fire, and that I shouldn't have used a dish rag or fire extinguisher until I was sure I was doing it properly. Honestly, I was just relieved that I didn't burn down the whole building. I learned a very valuable lesson that day: don't mess with things you don't understand, and for the love of God, read the instructions. Also, fire extinguishers are not as easy to use as the cartoons make them look. In the end, I had to stay with a friend for a few weeks while my apartment was repaired. The fire wasn't nearly as catastrophic as it could have been, but I'm lucky that I caught it in time. I can't believe how foolish I was, and every time I think about it, I cringe. My toaster now sits in the back of the cupboard, collecting dust. I'm definitely sticking to cereal from now on. Moral of the story: don't try to make toast if you don't know what you're doing. And maybe, just maybe, read the safety instructions on your appliances. You never know when they'll try to kill you. TIFU by trying to impress my boss with a perfect project presentation, and it turned into an absolute disaster. It all started last Tuesday. My company had been working on a huge project for months. It was one of those projects that everyone in the company talked about, the kind that gets the higher-ups excited, the one that could either make or break your career. I was the lead for this project, and everyone was counting on me to nail the final presentation. The night before the big day, I stayed late at the office. I was stressed, but determined. I'd been working on the presentation slides for days, making sure every detail was perfect. I meticulously organized every section, rehearsed my talking points over and over, and even practiced in front of my dog, who, let's be honest, wasn't much of a critic. Everything seemed set for success. The morning of the presentation, I was running on a couple hours of sleep, fueled mostly by coffee and anxiety. I wore my best suit, the one I reserved for interviews and big meetings. As I walked into the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I had a gut instinct that something was about to go horribly wrong. But I ignored it. What's the worst that could happen, right? The conference room was buzzing when I arrived. My boss, the department head, and several other key people from various teams were all seated, waiting for the presentation to begin. I had my laptop set up in front of the big screen, the slides ready, and I was trying to calm myself down as I fiddled with the remote clicker. The boss stood up and introduced me, his usual confident tone making me even more nervous. As I took the floor, I clicked the remote to start the first slide. And then everything went wrong. For some reason, the first slide didn't appear. Instead, a weird, distorted image of a cat wearing a tuxedo popped up on the screen. It wasn't even the type of cat that could be considered funny. It was just a badly edited Photoshop job that I had made a few days ago to send to my friend as a joke. I had completely forgotten about it. I froze. My mind raced, trying to make sense of why that image was there. I clicked the remote again, hoping it would fix the issue. But no, the cat stayed there, staring at the room with a look that could only be described as judgmental. The room went silent. I awkwardly clicked again, praying it would switch to the next slide. Nothing. The cat just stared. In a panic, I unplugged my laptop from the projector and plugged it back in. The cat was still there, front and center, as if it were mocking me. I began to explain to the room, fumbling over my words, trying to act like I knew exactly what was going on. Okay, that was, just a technical issue. Let me, fix that for you. I was sweating, and the worst part was that everyone was staring at me with the same confused and amused expression. The boss raised an eyebrow. I clicked the remote again, trying to move to the next slide. This time, the cat was gone, but instead of the sleek, professional title slide that I had designed, a meme from an old Facebook post popped up. It was one of those "you had one job" memes, where someone had accidentally put a G at the end of supper in a sign. I had no idea how this meme ended up in my presentation, but I swear I had never seen it before. But there it was, on the screen, much to my horror. I could feel my face turning crimson as I tried to laugh it off. So, yeah, let's just move on to the next slide, shall we? I said, voice trembling, before I clicked again. This time, the screen went black. Not just the slide, everything. The entire projector turned off. My boss stood up. I think we've seen enough for today, he said, in a tone that suggested he wasn't amused, not even a little. I wanted to die. The entire room stood up, exchanging awkward glances. My team, who had been relying on me to nail this presentation, was visibly embarrassed for me. I couldn't even look at anyone. I gathered my things as quickly as possible, and when I walked out of the conference room, I could hear the faint sound of laughter, but not the good kind. I ran straight to the break room, locked myself in the nearest bathroom, and started to cry. The whole thing felt like a nightmare. How could I have messed this up so badly? I had been so careful. It was supposed to be my shining moment, the time when I proved myself to my boss and made my mark. Instead, I had ruined it in the most spectacular fashion. But wait, it got worse. My boss called me into his office later that afternoon. I assumed he was going to fire me on the spot. I had ruined not only my chance but also the whole project, and I couldn't even begin to think of how to fix it. When I entered his office, he didn't look angry, he looked confused, like he wasn't sure what to say. He gestured for me to sit down. Look, I'm not going to sugarcoat it. That was bad. Really bad, he said, pausing to collect his thoughts. But I also have to admit, it was kind of impressive how you kept your composure in the face of utter disaster. I blinked, unsure whether he was serious or just being kind. He continued. That was, well, it wasn't the presentation we were expecting, but you handled yourself better than most people would in that situation. Honestly, most people would have just crumbled, but you tried to make the best out of it. I nodded, still not sure where this conversation was going. I'm not going to fire you, he said, after what felt like an eternity of silence. But I do expect a redo. Tomorrow. With a fully functional presentation. I left his office in shock. I had barely managed to scrape through this mess, and now I had to face it all over again the next day? The next morning, I showed up at the office hours before everyone else, determined to fix the damage I had done. I rewrote my slides, removed all the memes and cat pictures, and triple-checked the tech to make sure nothing could go wrong. When the time came, I gave the presentation again. It wasn't perfect, but it went without any major disasters. To my surprise, the project was approved, and we moved forward with the next phase. My boss even sent me an email afterward, thanking me for my perseverance. But deep down, I knew that the first attempt was a disaster I would never forget. Every time I think about it, I cringe so hard I almost collapse into a fetal position. So, yeah. TIFU by trying to impress my boss with a perfect project presentation, and instead I gave him the perfect comedy show. At least it wasn't a disaster that cost me my job, but it was a close call. TIFU by trying to impress my friends with an elaborate prank at my job and completely ruining my career. So this happened a few weeks ago, and it has taken me this long to even muster up the courage to write this out. Looking back, it's so ridiculous I can't even believe it went as badly as it did. I still can't shake the embarrassment and regret. But, as the title says, I tried to impress my friends with a big prank at my job, and let's just say I ended up ruining my career in the process. Let me explain. It all started a few months ago when my friends and I were having a typical weekend of hanging out, watching movies, and doing the usual stuff. We were all talking about our work lives, and I mentioned how my office was a pretty strict, buttoned-up environment. I work at a mid-sized tech company as a project manager, and let's just say that the culture there is very formal. It's not a place where people take risks or try to break the mold. Everyone dresses in business casual, keeps to themselves, and follows the rules like clockwork. It's a fine job, but honestly, it was starting to feel a bit stale. I was in desperate need of some excitement, and I thought this was my chance to do something crazy. One of my friends, let's call him Dave, is a huge prankster. He's the kind of guy who's always pulling harmless tricks on people. He's the one who convinced me that I should lighten up the office with a prank. Dave started suggesting ideas, nothing too outrageous, just something that would make people laugh and maybe break the tension a bit. The more we brainstormed, the more ridiculous the ideas got. Eventually, we came up with the perfect one. I would play a prank on my boss during our monthly all-hands meeting. Now, the thing you need to understand about my boss, let's call him Brad, is that he's very serious. He's the kind of guy who doesn't laugh easily, is always on top of everything, and maintains this air of authority that makes him a bit intimidating. Brad is a good boss, but he's got zero sense of humor. So when Dave suggested that I pull off an elaborate prank where I would fake a sudden disappearance during the meeting, I was hesitant at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought it would be hilarious. I figured it'd be a harmless stunt to break up the monotony of the meeting, and Brad, being the uptight guy he is, wouldn't know how to react. I could just play it off as a joke, and everyone would laugh. What could possibly go wrong? I decided to set everything in motion a few days before the meeting. I started putting together a plan that involved the entire meeting being recorded, as our all-hands were always live-streamed for employees in different locations. The idea was that I would have an emergency phone call right in the middle of the meeting, excuse myself, and then disappear from the building for an hour, making it seem like I had somehow vanished without a trace. Meanwhile, I would have one of my colleagues, Mark, sneak into the room and sit in my place, pretending to be me, just to add to the confusion. The day of the all-hands meeting came, and I was ready. I wore a suit and tie, trying to look as formal as possible, and made sure everything was set up. I even spoke to Mark beforehand and told him where he would need to sit and how he should act like he was me if anyone asked questions. The whole thing was planned down to the minute, and I was feeling pretty confident. I couldn't wait to see the look on everyone's face when I made my dramatic exit. So, the meeting starts, and everything is going according to plan. We're about 20 minutes in when I get the call. I dramatically stand up, excuse myself, and leave the room, leaving my colleagues to wonder what the hell just happened. The first few seconds went perfectly. People were staring at the door, confused, and I could tell they were all wondering if something serious had occurred. Perfect. The tension in the room was palpable. I slipped out of the building and hid in the parking garage, waiting for Mark to do his part. But then, things started going sideways. Instead of just sitting down and pretending to be me like we planned, Mark, for some godforsaken reason, decided to overdo it. He started mimicking my voice, making exaggerated gestures, and even cracking some jokes in my style, which, to be fair, isn't really funny in the first place. He basically started doing a full-on impression of me, but in the worst possible way. He was acting so strangely that people started to get suspicious. To make matters worse, there was an impromptu Q/and a session at the end of the meeting, and Brad called on me to answer a question. Now, Mark, who's known for being a terrible liar, panicked. Instead of just answering the question or deflecting, he blurted out some completely random and nonsensical response that made zero sense. The entire room went quiet, and I could only imagine how Brad was looking at him. I felt a wave of panic as I peeked out from my hiding spot, wondering what the hell was going on. At that moment, I realized this prank was going horribly wrong. I quickly tried to call Mark to tell him to stop and just play it cool, but my phone was dead. So, I was forced to just sit in the garage, unable to do anything, while my career was slowly going up in flames. Eventually, I decided to sneak back into the building. I walked in just in time to hear Brad demanding to know what the hell was going on. The whole team was awkwardly silent as Mark tried to explain, but it was too late. Brad had already caught on. The look on his face was not one of confusion but of complete and utter disbelief. He looked around the room, saw me standing there, and immediately asked me what was going on. Trying to salvage what was left of my dignity, I tried to play it off like it was just a joke, but no one was laughing. The room was dead silent, and Brad looked furious. The next few days were filled with awkward conversations and me trying to explain myself. I sent emails to everyone involved, apologizing profusely, but it was clear that the damage had been done. Brad called me into his office and told me that while he appreciated my creativity, this kind of behavior wasn't acceptable in the workplace. Long story short, my joke backfired spectacularly. It wasn't just that I got into trouble for the prank, it was that I had embarrassed myself and undermined the professionalism of the entire team. To make matters worse, my relationship with Brad has been strained ever since. I've lost the trust of my colleagues, and the office atmosphere is now more tense than it ever was before. So yeah, that's how I ruined my career by trying to be funny. In hindsight, I should have just stuck with a simple, harmless joke or, better yet, skipped the whole thing entirely. But now I know that trying to be the cool guy at work doesn't always work out the way you plan. I guess I'll be sticking to the boring, safe path for the foreseeable future. I've learned my lesson: don't mess with your job in the name of humor, especially if you work in a corporate setting where people take themselves a little too seriously. At least I'll have this story to tell in the future, as a cautionary tale. TIFU by trying to impress my new boss at work and ending up in the ER. So, this happened last Friday, and I'm still cringing about it. I've been working at this company for about 3 months now, and I finally got a chance to meet my boss in person. I had only been dealing with her via email and video calls, so I was eager to make a good impression when we had our first face-to-face meeting. Now, here's the thing: I've always been the kind of person who tries to be the funny guy in the office, you know, cracking a joke here and there, making people laugh. It's not like I go out of my way to be the clown, but I have a decent sense of humor, and I've gotten some good laughs from colleagues in the past. But I've never had a real chance to make a first impression on someone in such an important position. So, when I found out that my boss was coming into the office, I figured this was my big moment. I wanted to look confident and make her think, this guy, he's got potential. Plus, I knew there would be a bunch of other colleagues there too, and I wanted to stand out in a good way. I had this brilliant idea that I could show off my physical skills, let's say. You see, one of my hobbies is parkour. Yeah, I know, it sounds a little goofy when I say it out loud, but I've been doing it for a couple of years. Nothing too serious, just some rooftop vaults, running around obstacles, and the occasional wall flip. I'm not trying to become the next David Bell or anything, but I'm pretty decent at it. I figured if I could show my boss that I was not just book smart, but also agile and cool under pressure, she'd be impressed. Plus, I'd be the guy everyone would remember. So, I walked into the office that day, feeling confident, dressed in my usual smart casual attire. I did a quick scan of the office to see where my boss was, and I noticed she was talking to a few people near the break room. That was my chance. I could feel the excitement bubbling up in me. I knew she was going to be surrounded by some other employees, but I didn't care. I was ready to make an entrance. I decided to take the most dramatic route possible, which meant jumping from the second-floor balcony onto the lower level of the office floor, and then flipping onto the ground in front of her. I had done similar stunts before, but never in such an important setting. There was a railing on the second floor, and it wasn't particularly high, but it was just high enough to make it a wow moment. So, with all the courage I could muster, I climbed over the railing, got into position, and jumped. Everything was going perfectly for the first few seconds. The air rushed past me, and I had a clear path to land right on my feet. I was going to stick the landing and walk away like a hero. I was imagining the applause, the admiration, the raised eyebrows. Wow, this guy is impressive. I could already hear my coworkers whispering. But as I descended, I realized I had miscalculated just a little bit. Instead of landing on my feet like I had planned, I misjudged the distance. My foot hit the floor wrong, and I immediately felt something pop in my ankle. It was like a sudden sharp pain that shot through my leg. I didn't even have time to adjust myself. I tried to keep my balance and finish the stunt, but it was like my body refused to cooperate. I ended up crashing face first into the floor, with my leg twisted awkwardly beneath me. For a moment, everything was still. My face was pressed against the floor, my body in a heap. I could hear the gasps of my coworkers. Someone gasped, "Oh my God, is he okay?" and another person laughed nervously, probably because they thought it was part of the trick. Then the pain hit. My ankle was screaming in agony, and I could feel tears welling up in my eyes. I tried to get up, but my leg wasn't having it. I could barely move. At that moment, I realized my brilliant plan to impress my boss had turned into a full-blown disaster. Someone finally came to help me up, and I could tell they were trying to hold back their laughter. Another person grabbed a chair for me to sit on, and I tried to take deep breaths, hoping the pain would subside. My boss, who had been watching the whole thing unfold, walked over and asked, "Are you okay?" "Yeah, just a little, twisted," I mumbled, feeling absolutely mortified. I could hear the nervous chuckles from my coworkers, and I knew I had failed in the worst possible way. To make matters worse, it turns out I had really hurt myself. My ankle was swollen and bruised within minutes, and I couldn't even put weight on it. One of my coworkers offered to take me to the ER, and I reluctantly agreed, hoping that the whole situation would somehow improve. We arrived at the hospital, and after a few X-rays, the doctor informed me that I had a sprained ankle, but it was pretty severe. I would need crutches for at least 2 weeks, and I was told to rest it as much as possible. The rest of the day was a blur of embarrassment and regret. I couldn't stop thinking about how I had tried to make such a ridiculous impression on my boss and my coworkers, only to end up in the hospital. My coworkers were kind enough to send me a few texts, but they were all along the lines of "Hey, hope you're okay," and "That was wild, man," which only made me feel worse. When I finally had a chance to talk to my boss later, she was very understanding and assured me that she wasn't disappointed in me. She even told me it was nice to see someone with such enthusiasm. But I could tell she was holding back a smile, and I knew I had made a complete fool of myself. I'm pretty sure I'll never live that one down. So yeah, I tried to impress my boss by doing parkour in the office, and now I'm the guy who had to take a trip to the ER. And to add insult to injury, I'm now that guy who shows up to meetings on crutches for the next few weeks. At least my boss won't forget who I am, right? Moral of the story: don't try to impress your boss by doing stunts unless you're a professional. And don't underestimate the power of a good pair of comfortable shoes. So, this happened last weekend. It was a typical Saturday morning. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I had my whole day planned out. I was going to spend it with my girlfriend, Sarah. We've been together for about 2 years, and everything has been going pretty well, nothing major to complain about. We don't do big celebrations or fancy things, we're more the Netflix and chill type. But this day, we decided to step it up and go for something a little more adventurous. We had talked about hiking a few weeks ago, and Sarah had brought it up again earlier that week. I've always been more of a city person, but I thought, why not? I can probably tolerate it for a day. After all, it wasn't like we were climbing Mount Everest. It was supposed to be an easy, scenic trail. Just a couple of hours of walking in nature, right? Well, turns out, that was my first mistake, underestimating the power of a simple, easy trail. We decided to go to this nature reserve that's about an hour away. Sarah said she read reviews online that said it was a beginner-friendly hike, so we packed a picnic and set out. Now, I'm not completely clueless when it comes to outdoor activities. I've done a little hiking before, but I usually stick to the more popular trails with clear signage and lots of people. This trail, however, was a bit more isolated, but I didn't think it would be that big of a deal. When we got there, there were only a few cars parked in the lot, which I took as a good sign. I hate crowded trails, and Sarah was excited that it wasn't overrun with tourists. We set off on the path, chatting about random stuff, not really paying much attention to our surroundings at first. Sarah was ahead of me, leading the way, and I was mostly focused on trying to keep up and not embarrass myself with my lack of hiking expertise. About 20 minutes in, we came across a fork in the trail. One path was well marked and wide, the other looked a little more rugged, with overgrown brush on either side. I wasn't really paying attention to the map, but Sarah had mentioned she'd done some research beforehand, so I trusted her judgment. She said, "Let's take the rugged path, it looks more fun." Now, here's where I made my second mistake: I should have just stuck to the well-marked trail. But I didn't want to seem like a wimp, so I agreed. We veered off the main path, thinking it would be a short detour. The next 30 minutes were uneventful, but I started to notice that the trail was getting more difficult. The ground was uneven, and the incline was becoming steeper. My legs were starting to ache, but I kept pushing forward. Sarah, on the other hand, was in great spirits, moving ahead with ease, as if she was born for this. I had to admit, it was kind of impressive. I tried to match her pace, but I was already starting to feel winded. Eventually, we reached a clearing that overlooked the valley below. It was gorgeous. The view was breathtaking, and I could see why Sarah had been so eager to hike this particular trail. But, while I was taking in the scenery, I noticed something odd. There were no other hikers around. No one. I mean, I knew it was a relatively quiet trail, but I hadn't seen a single person in the past 45 minutes, and now, it was completely silent. That's when I started to get a weird feeling. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe we had gone off course. My gut told me we were supposed to be on the easier trail, but I didn't say anything at first. I didn't want to sound paranoid or like a buzzkill. But then, Sarah turned to me and said, "I think we're lost." I laughed it off, trying to act cool. "Nah, we're fine. We're just a little off the main path, that's all." But deep down, I wasn't so sure. We had been hiking for over an hour now, and I couldn't remember the last time I saw a trail marker or signpost. Sarah pulled out her phone to check the map, but of course, no signal. The area was just remote enough to drop our connection. This only made the situation more concerning. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but my mind started racing. What if we couldn't find our way back? What if we were deep in the woods with no way out? We decided to keep going, thinking we might eventually find the path again. But the further we went, the more difficult it became. The trail had completely disappeared, replaced by thick brush and tangled roots. We had to crawl under fallen trees and jump over rocks. Every step felt like it was taking us further away from civilization. After what felt like an eternity, we reached a creek. I wasn't sure if it was the same creek I saw earlier on the map, but it seemed to be flowing in the wrong direction. At this point, I knew something was off. I turned to Sarah, who had this worried look on her face, and said, "Okay, we need to turn back." But Sarah wasn't having it. She was determined to keep going, and I didn't want to argue, so I reluctantly followed her. We crossed the creek, slipping and getting our shoes wet in the process. But things took a turn for the worse when Sarah slipped on a rock and twisted her ankle. She let out a sharp cry and crumpled to the ground. I freaked out. I knew I wasn't in the best shape for a rescue mission, but I also couldn't just leave her behind. I helped her up, and we hobbled along, trying to figure out a way to get back. By this point, we were both exhausted, our water bottles long emptied, and the sun was beginning to set. It felt like we had been hiking for hours without any real progress. I knew I needed help. I started yelling, hoping someone would hear us. No response. My panic was rising. The thought of being stuck in the woods overnight was terrifying, especially with Sarah injured. That's when we finally heard a voice. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder. "Hey! Are you guys okay?" I looked around, and to my relief, a couple of hikers appeared out of nowhere. They had been on the main trail, and they must have heard me calling. They were friendly enough, and after explaining the situation, they helped us find the right path back to the trailhead. By the time we made it back to the car, it was dark, and we were both completely drained. I had learned a valuable lesson that day: nature is unpredictable, and sometimes even the easy trails can lead you down a much more difficult path than you expect. We drove home in silence, both of us reflecting on the day's events. I felt incredibly guilty for not speaking up sooner, and Sarah was understandably upset about the whole situation. I promised her we'd stick to more beginner-friendly hikes from now on. It's been a week since then, and I still can't believe how badly I messed up. I guess I'll stick to the couch and a good Netflix series next time. At least then, I won't end up lost in the woods with an injured girlfriend and a serious lesson in overconfidence. TIFU by accidentally sending a highly embarrassing message to my boss, and now I have to figure out how to undo the damage. So, to start off, I'm a mid-level manager at a small marketing firm. Things are going relatively smoothly at work, and I'm pretty comfortable in my position. I've been with the company for about 4 years now, and, up until this point, I've managed to avoid any major screw-ups. Well, that all changed last week. I had just wrapped up a stressful meeting with my team, where we were discussing an upcoming campaign. It was one of those meetings where you end up juggling a million things at once. We were texting, emailing, and running through ideas, all while trying to maintain some level of professionalism. Once the meeting ended, I went back to my desk, a little frazzled, and tried to catch up on the work I had been neglecting during the meeting. Now, here's where things went south. I have this close-knit group of coworkers who I chat with outside of work. We text regularly about the usual office gossip, complain about our crazy boss, and share memes. Nothing too wild, just the usual water cooler stuff. One of the main people in our group chat is my good friend Mike, who's also a manager at the company. We were talking about the latest campaign ideas when Mike sent a meme making fun of our boss, Dave. Dave is, well, a bit of a difficult person. He's one of those micromanagers who insists on being involved in every single detail, even the things that don't matter. Now, Mike sent this meme of Dave looking stressed at his desk, with the caption, "When you think your brilliant ideas are the only ones that matter." We all had a good laugh about it in the group, as it was a pretty accurate portrayal of Dave's behavior. In my frustration about the campaign, I quickly typed up a reply that said, "God, Dave is such a pain." He seriously thinks every idea he comes up with is genius. I can't wait for him to ruin this campaign like all the others. I hit send, but here's where things get messy. I didn't send that message to Mike and the group. Instead, I sent it directly to Dave. Yes, I accidentally texted my boss the message where I called him a pain and criticized his ideas. To make matters worse, I didn't even realize it for about 30 minutes. I had opened my phone to check for any updates and noticed that there was no reply from Dave. I figured maybe he was busy or didn't feel like responding. But then I noticed that the message I had sent was marked as read, and I was like, wait a second. That's when I opened the message thread, and my stomach dropped. There, in all its horrific glory, was my text message to Dave, which read, God, Dave is such a pain. He seriously thinks every idea he comes up with is genius. I can't wait for him to ruin this campaign like all the others. I stared at the screen for a good minute, feeling the panic rise in my chest. My heart was pounding, and I felt like I was going to pass out. Dave hadn't responded yet, which I guess was some kind of blessing, but I knew that couldn't last long. The reality of what I had just done was starting to sink in. I had just criticized my boss in the worst way possible, and there was no way to take it back. I quickly typed a desperate, poorly thought-out apology. Hey, Dave, sorry about that message. It was meant for a friend, not you. I didn't mean it. I knew that wasn't going to cut it, but I hit send anyway, praying that he would be understanding. To make things even worse, my phone buzzed just as I was trying to collect myself. Dave had finally responded, and my stomach dropped again as I saw the notification. It simply read, we need to talk. I felt like I was in a dream, a horrible nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. I quickly stood up, grabbed my jacket, and headed to Dave's office. I knocked and walked in, trying to act casual, but I could tell from the look on his face that the atmosphere was far from casual. Dave had his arms crossed, and he gestured for me to sit down. So, what was that message about? He asked, his voice surprisingly calm but with an edge I couldn't quite place. I could feel my palms sweating, my heart racing as I tried to come up with some way to explain myself. I stammered, well, Dave, you see, I didn't mean it. It was a joke. It was meant for a friend, not you. I'm really sorry. I got frustrated about the campaign, and it came out wrong. I didn't mean anything I said. I swear. Dave looked at me for a long moment, and I could practically hear the gears turning in his head. I was fully expecting him to fire me on the spot or, at the very least, give me a serious warning. Instead, after what felt like an eternity of silence, he finally spoke. You know, I've been hearing some things from the team, and I think I need to reconsider how I approach things. I might not be perfect, but I do try my best, and I can be a bit too hands-on sometimes. If that's been frustrating for you, I can understand that. I was stunned. I had expected a reprimand or some form of punishment, but instead, he seemed almost apologetic. Maybe he was just trying to save face, but either way, it wasn't the worst outcome. We spent the next few minutes talking about how I could help him better manage things moving forward, and while it wasn't exactly a glowing conversation, it wasn't a disaster either. By the end of it, I was still employed, and Dave didn't seem as angry as I'd imagined. Afterward, I felt like I had narrowly dodged a bullet. But the damage was done. My coworkers found out about the incident, of course, and now every time I interact with Dave, I'm a little more self-conscious. I don't think he's holding a grudge or anything, but I'm definitely walking on eggshells, trying to make sure I don't put my foot in my mouth again. Lesson learned: never, ever let frustration get the better of you when texting. And maybe don't make jokes about your boss that can be accidentally sent to him. Honestly, I think I'll be a lot more careful about venting in group chats from now on. But yeah, TIFU by accidentally texting my boss an embarrassing message. And now I have to figure out how to undo the damage to my career and reputation. TIFU by trying to impress my friends with my cooking skills and nearly burning down my apartment complex. So, I've always been the kind of guy who likes to try new things, especially when it comes to cooking. I can't say I'm a master chef or anything, but I've had some decent success with dishes like spaghetti and chile. However, my friends, who are all pretty good cooks themselves, had never actually seen me make anything from scratch. They were always talking about their impressive home-cooked meals, and I figured this was my chance to show them that I could hold my own in the kitchen. I thought about it for a while and decided that I would try to make a homemade lasagna. It seemed like the perfect dish, not too complicated but still impressive. I had been watching a lot of cooking videos online, and I figured I had it in the bag. Plus, lasagna requires layers, and if there's one thing I can do, it's layering. I've layered pizza toppings like a pro, so how different could it be? I went to the grocery store, spent way more than I intended on premium ground beef, mozzarella, ricotta, fresh basil, and the fancy lasagna noodles that you don't have to pre-boil. I was feeling pretty good about myself at this point. I had all the ingredients, and I was ready to start cooking. I invited my friends over for the evening and told them I was making lasagna from scratch. Everyone was excited because they knew I wasn't the best cook, and they were looking forward to either being pleasantly surprised or enjoying the chaos that would inevitably unfold. Honestly, I kind of expected the latter. But, hey, I was determined to prove them wrong. The first red flag came when I began browning the beef. I had a non-stick skillet that I loved, and it worked perfectly for almost everything. But for some reason, I didn't think about how much grease the beef would release. The pan was starting to look a little too full, but I ignored it and continued stirring. Big mistake. The grease started splattering everywhere, and I realized that I had no idea how to properly drain it. I didn't have a colander, so I just used a paper towel and attempted to sop up the grease like a disaster response team. Not the best method, but I thought it'd do the trick. I moved on to layering the ingredients in the lasagna pan, but this is where things really started to go south. I followed the recipe to a T, or so I thought. The sauce I had made from scratch was bubbling away, the noodles seemed to be perfect, and the ricotta mixture was smooth. But, apparently, I forgot one crucial detail: I didn't account for how much the lasagna would actually expand in the oven. As I was layering the noodles, sauce, and cheese, I noticed the pan was getting dangerously close to the top. It was too late to stop now, so I shoved everything into the oven, hoping for the best. As soon as I closed the oven door, I heard a sizzling sound, followed by a faint smell of something burning. I figured it was just the sauce cooking or the cheese melting, so I didn't think much of it. I set the timer and went back to chatting with my friends in the living room, trying to act casual despite the building sense of dread in my gut. About 20 minutes into baking, the smell got worse. It was a distinct burning odor, but I still wasn't sure what was happening. I thought maybe a bit of sauce had spilled over the edge, so I decided to check on it. When I opened the oven door, I was greeted with an unpleasant sight. A pool of bubbling tomato sauce and cheese was spilling over the side of the pan, dripping onto the oven floor. I quickly turned the oven light off and closed the door, hoping it would somehow fix itself. Spoiler alert, it didn't. I told my friends I needed to deal with something in the kitchen and rushed back in. The mess had already started to smoke a little bit. Panic set in. I had no idea what to do. I opened the oven again, and that's when I realized that the sauce had pooled so much that it was actually starting to burn on the bottom of the oven. The smoke was thickening, and the smell was absolutely horrific. My first instinct was to turn the oven off, but that only made the smoke linger longer. I quickly grabbed a towel and tried to wipe some of the sauce off the oven floor, but it was a futile effort. Everything I touched just made the problem worse. At this point, my friends started coming into the kitchen, alerted by the smoke alarm going off in the hallway. I could hear them laughing nervously, asking if I needed help. But there was nothing they could do. I had, apparently, created a lasagna so messy that it was now a fire hazard. One of my friends, who had more experience with cooking disasters, grabbed the fire extinguisher from the hallway and handed it to me. Just in case, they said with a half-joking tone. That was when I realized I might be in way over my head. I took the lasagna out of the oven, and the mess just kept getting worse. More sauce had spilled over, and the cheese was blackened in places. It was a disaster. I set the pan down on the counter and looked at it with a sense of resignation. All of that effort, all that pride, and this was the result. My friends, who had been standing around nervously, all took one look at the charred mess and broke into laughter. I could barely look them in the eye. But we weren't done yet. In the middle of my humiliation, I heard a loud pop. A loud, cracking sound, followed by the unmistakable scent of something burning. I turned around, and to my horror, I saw a small flame shooting up from the back of the oven. Apparently, some of the grease from the beef had dripped down onto the oven's heating element, and now I was dealing with an actual fire. I panicked, but thankfully, I managed to turn the oven off and grab the fire extinguisher in time. The kitchen was filled with white powder as I emptied the extinguisher over the oven. By the time it was all over, my friends and I stood in stunned silence, looking at the mess that used to be a potential gourmet meal. After everything settled down, we ended up ordering pizza. My friends were still laughing, but they were genuinely concerned for a moment. We spent the rest of the night watching Netflix and eating pizza, but every now and then, someone would mention the disaster that had just unfolded in my kitchen. In the end, I learned a few things. First, never try to cook an ambitious dish when you don't fully understand the process. Second, always make sure your oven is clean before attempting anything with sauce. And third, maybe just stick to spaghetti next time. So, yeah. I didn't impress anyone with my cooking, but I did manage to give them a story they'll never forget. TLDR, tried to impress my friends by cooking lasagna from scratch. Burned the kitchen, nearly set off a fire, and ended up ordering pizza instead. The lasagna was a disaster. Never try to cook an ambitious dish without fully understanding how to do it first. Thank you for watching until the end. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss new videos. Also, leave a comment, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Your support and engagement mean a lot to me. See you in the next video.